Monday, 28th of September 1942. Dearest Kitty, I had to stop yesterday though I was nowhere near finished. I'm dying to tell you about another one of our clashes, but before I do, I'd like to say this. I think it's odd that grown-ups quarrel so easily and so often about such petty matters. Up till now, I always thought bickering was just something children did and that they outgrew it. Of course, there's sometimes a reason to have a real quarrel, but the verbal exchanges that take place here are just plain bickering. I should be used to the fact that these squabbles are daily occurrences, but I'm not, and I never will be, as long as I'm the subject of nearly every discussion. They refer to these as discussions instead of quarrels, but Germans don't know the difference. They criticise everything, and I mean everything. About me, my behaviour, my personality, my manners, every inch of me from head to toe and back again is the subject of gossip and debate. Harsh words and shouts are constantly being flung at my head, though I'm absolutely not used to it. According to the powers that be, I'm supposed to grin and bear it, but I can't. I have no intention of taking their insults lying down. I'll show them that Anne Frank wasn't born yesterday. They'll sit up and take notice and keep their big mouths shut when I make them see that they ought to attend to their own manners instead of mine. How dare they behave like that? It's simply barbaric. I've been astonished time and again at such rudeness, and most of all at such stupidity, Mrs. Van Daan. But as soon as I've got used to the idea, and that shouldn't take long, I'll give them a taste of their own medicine, and then they'll change their tune. Am I really as bad-mannered, headstrong, stubborn, pushy, stupid, lazy, etc., as the Van Daans say I am? No, of course not. I know I've got my faults and my shortcomings, but they blow them all out of proportion. If only you knew, Kitty, how I seethe when they scold and mock me. It won't take long before I explode with pent-up rage. But enough of that. I've bored you long enough with my quarrels, and yet I can't resist adding a highly interesting dinner conversation. Somehow we landed on the subject of Pym's extreme diffidence. His modesty is a well-known fact, which even the stupidest person wouldn't dream of questioning. All of a sudden, Mrs. Van Daan, who feels the need to bring herself into every conversation, remarked, "I'm very modest and retiring too, much more so than my husband. Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous? This sentence clearly illustrates that she's not exactly what you'd call modest." Mr. Van Daan, who felt obliged to explain the much more so than my husband, answered calmly, "I have no desire to be modest and retiring. In my experience, you get a lot further by being pushy." And turning to me, he added, "Don't be modest and retiring, Anne. It'll get you nowhere." Mother agreed completely with this viewpoint, but as usual, Mrs. Van Daan had to have her twopenn'orth. This time, however, instead of addressing me directly, she turned to my parents and said, "You must have a strange outlook on life to be able to say that to Anne. Things were different when I was growing up, though they probably haven't changed much since then, except in your modern household." This was a direct hit at Mother's modern child-rearing methods, which she's defended on many occasions. Mrs. Van Daan was so upset that her face turned bright red. People who flush easily become even more agitated when they feel themselves getting hot under the collar, and they quickly lose to their opponents. The non-flush mother, who now wanted to have the matter over and done with as quickly as possible, paused for a moment to think before she replied, "Well, Mrs. Van Daan, I agree that it's much better if a person isn't over-modest. My husband, Margot and Peter are all exceptionally modest. Your husband, Anne and I, they're not exactly the opposite, don't let ourselves be pushed around." Mrs. Van Daan, "Oh, but Mrs. Frank, I don't understand what you mean. Honestly, I'm extremely modest and retiring. How can you say I'm pushy?" Mother, "I didn't say you were pushy, but no one would describe you as having a retiring disposition." Mrs. Van D, "I'd like to know in what way I'm pushy. If I didn't look out for myself here, no one else would, and I'd soon starve, but that doesn't mean I'm not as modest and retiring as your husband." Mother had no choice but to laugh at this ridiculous self-defence, which irritated Mrs. Van Daan. Not exactly a born debater, she continued her magnificent account in a mixture of German and Dutch until she got so tangled up in her own words that she finally rose from her chair and was just about to leave the room when her eye fell on me. You should have seen her. As luck would have it, the moment Mrs. Van D turned around, I was shaking my head in a combination of compassion and irony. I wasn't doing it on purpose, but I'd followed her tirade so intently that my reaction was completely involuntary. Mrs. Van D wheeled around and gave me a tongue lashing. Hard, Germanic, mean and vulgar, exactly like some fat, red-faced fishwife. It was a joy to behold. If I could draw, I'd have liked to have sketched her as she was then. She struck me as so comical. That silly little scatterbrain. I've learned one thing. You only get to know a person after a row. Only then you can judge their true character. Yours, Anne. Tuesday, 29th September 1942. Dearest Kitty, the strangest things happen to you when you're in hiding. Try to picture this. Because we don't have a bath, we wash ourselves in a tin tub. And because there's only hot water in the office, by which I mean the entire lower floor, the 7 of us take turns making the most of this great opportunity. But since no 2 of us are alike, and we're all plagued by varying degrees of modesty, each member of the family has selected a different place to wash. Peter takes a bath in the office kitchen, even though it has a glass door. When it's time for his bath, he goes round to each of us in turn and announces that we shouldn't walk past the kitchen for the next half an hour. He considers this measure to be sufficient. Mr. Van D takes his bath upstairs, reasoning that the safety of his own room outweighs the difficulty of having to carry the hot water up all those stairs. Mrs. Van D has yet to take a bath. She's waiting to see which is the best place. Father washes in the private office and Mother in the kitchen behind a fireguard, while Margot and I have declared the front office to be our bathing grounds. Since the curtains are drawn on Saturday afternoon, we scrub ourselves in the dark, while the one who isn't in the bath looks out of the window through a chink in the curtains and gazes in wonder at the endlessly amusing people. A week ago, I decided I didn't like this spot and have been on the lookout for more comfortable quarters. It was Peter who gave me the idea of setting my tin bath in the spacious office lavatory. I can sit down, turn on the light, lock the door, pour out the water with anyone's help, and all without the fear of being seen. I used my lovely bathroom for the first time on Sunday, and strange as it may seem, I like it better than any other place. The plumber was at work downstairs on Wednesday, moving the water pipes and drains from the office lavatory to the passage so the pipes won't freeze during a cold winter. The plumber's visit was far from pleasant. Not only were we not allowed to run water during the day, but the lavatory was also out of bounds. I'll tell you how we handled this problem. You may find it unseemly of me to bring it up, but I'm not so prudish about matters of this kind. On the day of our arrival, Father and I improvised a chamber pot, sacrificing a preserving jar for this purpose. For the duration of the plumber's visit, preserving jars were put into service during the daytime to hold our calls of nature. As far as I was concerned, this wasn't half as difficult as having to sit still all day and not say a word. You can imagine how hard that was for Miss Quack, Quack, Quack. On ordinary days, we have to speak in a whisper. Not being able to talk or move at all is 10 times worse. After 3 days of constant sitting, my backside was stiff and sore. Nightly calisthenics helped. Yours, Anne. Thursday, 1st of October 1942. Dear Kitty, yesterday I had a horrible fright. At 8 o'clock the doorbell suddenly rang. All I could think of was that someone was coming to get us. You know who I mean. But I calmed down when everyone swore it must have either been the pranksters or the postman. The days here are very quiet. Mr. Levinson, a little Jewish chemist, is doing some experiments for Mr. Kugler in the kitchen. Since he's familiar with the entire building, we're in constant dread that he'll take it into his head to go and have a look at what used to be the laboratory. We're as still as baby mice. Who would have guessed that 3 months ago that Quicksilver Anne would have to sit so quietly for hours on end, and what's more, that she could. Mrs. Van Daan's birthday was the 29th. Though we didn't have a large celebration, she was showered with flowers, simple gifts and good food. Apparently the red carnations from her spouse are a family tradition. Let me pause for a moment on the subject of Mrs. Van Daan and tell you that her attempts to flirt with Father are a constant source of irritation for me. She pats him on the cheek and head, pulls up her skirt and makes so-called witty remarks in an effort to get Pim's attention. Fortunately, he doesn't respond. He neither finds her pretty or charming, and he doesn't respond to her flirtations. As you know, I'm quite the jealous type, and I can't abide her behaviour. After all, Mother doesn't act that way to Mr. Van D, which is what I told Mrs. Van D, right to her face. From time to time, Peter can be very amusing. He and I have one thing in common. We like to dress up, which makes everyone laugh. One evening we made our appearance with Peter in one of his mother's skin-tight dresses and me in his suit. He wore a hat, I had a cap on. The grown-ups split their sides laughing, and we enjoyed ourselves every bit as much. Bet bought new skirts for Margot and me at the Bienenkorf. The fabric is hideous, like the sacks that potatoes come in. Just the kind of thing that department stores wouldn't dare sell in the olden days, now costing 24 guilders, Margot's, and 7 75 guilders. 9. We have a nice treat in store. Beps ordered a correspondence course in shorthand for Margot Peace from me. Just you wait. By this time next year, we'll be able to take perfect shorthand. In any case, learning to write a secret code like that is really interesting. I have a terrible pain in my index finger on my left hand, so I can't do any ironing. What luck. Mr. Van Daan wants me to sit next to him at the table since Margot doesn't eat enough to suit him. That's all right with me. I like changes. There's always a tiny black cat roaming around the yard, and it reminds me of my dear sweet Mochi. Another reason I welcome the change is that Mummy's always carping at me, especially at the table. Now Margot will have to bear the brunt of it, or rather won't, since Mother doesn't make such sarcastic remarks to her, not to that paragon of virtue. I'm always teasing Margot about being a paragon of virtue these days, and she hates it. Maybe it'll teach her not to be such a goody-goody. High time she learned. To end this hodgepodge of news, a particularly amusing joke told by Mr. Van Daan. What goes click 99 times and clack once? A centipede with a club foot. Bye-bye, Anne.